Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Going to Be All Right. I'm Clayton Gwen, and in this episode, we're going to get a little controversial. We're going to go far outside of our professional expertise, and we're maybe going to be a little bit topical, things not just specific to writing, but current events as well.
Move to a different realm. Maybe not.
Potentially the people who are involved in the things we're going to look at were in a different realm. So first of all, maybe we should just start with how is it that we really came to what it is we're going to talk about, which is still so shrouded in mystery. We were looking basically for an article, a peer-reviewed scientific article to analyze and just talk over some things that we've been going through in the webinar series that we've been offering to PhD candidates. So these webinars are available on our YouTube channel if you'd want to go see some of the kind of more writing principle specific ideas we've been working on. But we've been talking about structure, how to organize and link things and form an introduction, and how that can inform the structure and design of research articles. So we were going to go and basically just find something and break one down.
Yeah, and we did something similar last season. I think it was episode number 5 or 6, if I'm not mistaken. We talked about it was like an article that was about COVID-19, or at least about SARS. The SARS virus, and it was to a certain extent compared to COVID-19, if I'm not mistaken. But we were analyzing the abstract, so we were planning on doing something similar for this season because we thought that it would be a good idea to be really hands-on, at least one episode each season that we demonstrate our craft and that we share our screens and go through an article. But then you discovered something.
Yes, I was trying to find, as any good researcher will do, something worth researching. So I did a general internet search. And I thought, you know what? Why not go and start at a science journalism website? So I went to sciencenews.org, and lo and behold, the other day when I pulled this article up, the main headline article was psilocybin mushrooms and their effect on people suffering from depression. And
so for anybody who doesn't know what it is, because this might be important, psilocybin mushrooms aren't just any kind of mushrooms that you eat. It's mushrooms that are psychoactive, so they will give you a psychedelic effect. That's
strong hallucinogenic effect if you take them in high doses. And so a disclaimer right now, we're not advocating that people go and take these. Our professional standpoint will disallow that. Also, we're going to be looking over an article that comes from the Journal of the American Medical Association of Psychiatry. So we're not psychiatrists, nor are we doctors. But we also thought that this would be a rather relevant article to maybe piece apart, because at least through our workings with the Writing and Learning Center, there's been a lot of discussion the last 2 months, I think, around mental health, especially as here in southern Norway. For me in Oslo, and I think for NMBU as a whole, there's been a lot of restrictions, again, because of COVID-19.
COVID wave number 2.
Yes. So there's been an increased attention on student and faculty and employee mental health. And so it kind of seemed like, hey, we could do something that is both a little bit controversial, especially because this in the United States, psychoactive, hallucinogenic drugs are illicit, illegal, and due to their war on drugs and all sorts of things like that. So I believe it's actually been very hard for the medical disciplines to conduct research on
because these are Schedule 1 drugs. So that means that there are very strong restrictions on what you can do. You can't even conduct scientific research. And I think that's been going on since the 60s, and then they opened up a little bit in the early 2000s. And I think the study that we're going to talk about today is something that was done at in I think John Hopkins University Hospital or something was in charge of it. I
believe so, yes.
So it was done a couple of years ago. It's not brand new. But it's interesting, and it's very controversial because it's been it's not been allowed to do this kind of research for 40, 50 years.
Mm-hmm. And I think probably a lot of people who may have followed some of this, and especially for me as a Canadian, this was certainly large talk in North America, especially when other sorts of illicit drugs were becoming legalized. That this was an issue that kept popping back up. The impact on medical research's ability to conduct research on potential health benefits of things like psilocybin mushrooms or marijuana. Now, again, this is very far outside of the sphere of expertise that we hold and what we do on this podcast as writing advisors. But we just wanted to kind of prime you as to why we're talking about this and how it came to be. And maybe, especially when it comes down to, increased quarantines for people, more restrictions, shutting down of cultural and sports events and group events, the university really restricting access to classrooms and to campus in various degrees. Maybe to have something on mental health we thought was also a little bit topical and important. So also just remember as a disclaimer, if you are seeking any kind of mental health support, there are services available if you're a student or employee through NMBU, which you can find information through the NMBU main webpage.
You should get in touch with SIT, Studentenes Informasjonstorg. They are in close contact with the helsestasjon, Ås Health Station, and they deal with mental health. So get in touch with them if this is something that affects your life. But also think it's important to... Another reason that we decided to pick this article is because it's controversial, and it's also because it's on the front page of a relatively well-known... what should you call it? Like... just scientific journalism. And a lot of people devour that. They don't really read the actual article from some kind of scientific journal. They read articles like that, news articles about science. And you probably, it's the same thing. Lots of my Facebook friends, they follow all these different profiles that have that focus on scientific news, and then it's news articles just like this. It's journalism. So this is why I think it's an important thing to talk about, because people really have a tendency to learn about scientific topics through articles like that.
And so this gave us a really good opportunity to not only deal with something that's rather topical, deal with something that's also controversial, allow us to kind of break down scientific writing through the lens of a writing advisor, but we're also, in the later half, going to compare how does peer-reviewed science writing, the phrasing, the wording, claims of certainty, how is that described in a manuscript or an article that's published in a peer-reviewed journal, compared to how these same articles and their results are interpreted and made into what is known as science journalism or science news, basically. So now that we've given you a primer of everything, why don't we go and pull up the article? This is coming from the JAMA Psychiatry Research Journal, or the Journal of the American Medical Association, specifically their section on psychiatry. And the title of this is Effects of Psilocybin-Assisted Therapy on Major Depressive Disorder, a Randomized Clinical Trial. So what are some of the things immediately that we can pull out of this, Nicholas, just from reading its title?
Well, first of all, there's no certainty here, because then that would be in the title. So it's pretty obvious that this is... They've done... they tested it out on people, and they've got some results. But these results are maybe not strong enough, or maybe there's not enough participants to say anything concrete. That's at least something that I'm getting from this title. If the results were outstanding, I think it would be present in the title to a certain extent.
So we can also see a few other things from from the title that's presented here, especially the secondary title, a randomized clinical trial, we're going to assume immediately that this is going to be a report of empirical research. So the structure is very likely going to follow the quite natural IMRAD structure: introduction, methods, results, discussion. That is very common within the natural sciences. But we can also pull out a few other things from this. It's obviously an experiment because it's a randomized clinical trial. So we know that the research is being conducted obviously on humans. We kind of have an idea of what the research question or the hypothesis could be from this title as well, don't we?
We get a lot of information, and we also get information about the methods that they applied. Because the secondary title, a randomized clinical trial, okay, that's the method, or at least one of them. So we get a lot of information about, as you said, thesis statement, or at least research questions, their focus, their scope. It seems like it's MDD, major depressive disorder. That's what they've been focusing on. And there's a lot of other things. There's more information here about how depressed you had to be in order to be qualified. And you couldn't be too depressed, because that would make you possibly suicidal, and there would be a lot of different things that they would have to take into consideration. So you had to be within a certain spectrum. So you can get a lot of information just from the title.
Absolutely. And obviously, for anybody who is watching this on YouTube instead of just listening to the podcast version, you can see that it clearly shows the objective here, but we could have extracted that from the title as well. They're obviously investigating the effects of psilocybin as a form of assisted therapy for its effect on depression disorder treatment.
And the article we're looking at now is obviously following a very standardized, what you can call a recipe. So a lot of the same, there's a lot of repetition, because there are already established boxes for every kind of different thing. So there's one for importance, one for objective, one for design, setting, and participants. And then throughout the article, I mean, it's obviously focused around the IMRAD structure: introduction, methods, introduction, results, methods, and discussion. But they've been kind of creating a bunch of different subheadings to really explain their method and what they actually did. And the methods chapter the methods section is the most extensive in this particular article. Very typical for the natural sciences.
Especially for medicine as well, where you're probably wanting to replicate this elsewhere. Now, one thing that I thought was rather interesting in the structure of this is that the abstract doesn't come in the form of what you would expect an abstract to look like, about 200 to 300 words as a single paragraph that summarizes all of this. It immediately starts out with basically breaking apart the abstract into importance, objective, design, setting, and participants, interventions, main outcomes and measures, results, and then conclusions and relevance, followed by information about the trial registration, and then where it was published. So you can also see from this design of how they're setting up almost an abstract that acts as a key information, an overview, which is what an abstract does. But this really clearly provides you with information on, the fullest overview that you need. You could read this and know exactly what was done. And you can also see by the establishment of this form of abstract or kind of key points, the importance and the objective are quite short relative to the size of the design, setting, and participants, interventions, main outcomes and measures, and results. So as you've already said, the methods and the results are kind of the most extensive section in the actual paper. And so what's really cool about this, I think, is how there is this sort of parallel logic is how I usually call it, or basically you'll hear it as a mirroring. You can kind of create an abstract that mirrors or has a parallel logic to how the rest of your article is established. Basically meaning that from this we can before we read anything, we could kind of figure out, oh, the most extensive parts are going to be the methods and the results section, with the introduction and the conclusion being much, much shorter.
I mean, this kind of structure also makes it very friendly for any kind of scientific journalist that wants to write something about this, because it's very easy to navigate, and all the important aspects are kind of highlighted at the beginning of the article. So you know what to focus on when you're going to write a relatively short news article.
Yes.
Because you obviously need to extract the most, I'm not going to say the most important information, but at least the most eye-catching. So the article actually does a pretty good job of doing that on its own. So in here you can see key points. That's
and
something
on top of that, they also have...
it's not really standard.
Yeah. It's not anything new that wasn't already presented before, but these key points are kind of like an even more condensed overview. So they immediately give us the research question: is psilocybin-assisted therapy efficacious or efficacious, depending on how you want to pronounce that, among patients with major depressive disorder? Findings in this randomized clinical trial of 24 participants with major depressive disorder, participants who received immediate psilocybin-assisted therapy compared with delayed treatment, showed improvements in blinded clinician rater-assessed depression severity and in self-reported secondary outcomes through the 1-month follow-up. The meaning: this randomized clinical trial found that psilocybin-assisted therapy was efficacious in producing large, rapid, and sustained antidepressant effects in patients with major depressive disorder. We wouldn't need to read that much further to know what kind of came out of this. But of course, much like the abstract, these key points are just kind of an overview. They don't provide us with a lot of other information about maybe why is this research question important. And so I think that leads us to a good opportunity to we're just probably going to look at the structure of the introduction and break down some key ideas of how this kind of research is established, not obviously just for the, psychiatric medical professionals who might be interested in treating or researching depression, but also how this is linked to a much broader global issue. That's what I thought was very interesting when I ended up reading the introduction, is seeing how nicely they follow this sort of general down to specific research that they're going to do through this randomized clinical trial. And that's something we talk about all the time, moving your audience from general to specific.
And they also put it in, as you said, in a larger context, which is also something that we always advise students to do, that they can really see what. Let's say that someone is writing a master's thesis, then it's nice if they can relate their results or what they figured out to a broader context. And the reason for that is to show how to apply the things that you have figured out into the real world, or to know what you're going to continue researching on if you decide to take a PhD, for example. And here we have the context is, there's a lot of things that they have decided to include, but this is the 300 million individuals worldwide. A lot of people, big problem. And also connecting this to disability. People suffering from depression have a much higher risk of suffering from disability, and so on. So that they are really connecting this to a much broader context. So it's not just about psilocybin research and depression, but it's a major issue when it comes to people's health. And especially now during a pandemic where so many people are cut off from any kind of social interaction.
So this is all this information you're extracting from just the first paragraph of the introduction. So again, for those of you who aren't watching this and seeing the screen and being able to read this yourself, the first paragraph is Major depressive disorder, MDD, is a substantial public health concern affecting more than 300 million individuals worldwide. Depression is the number one cause of disability, as you had said, Nicholas, and the relative risk of all-cause mortality for those with depression is 1.7 times greater than the risk for the general public. That's cited information coming from another study.
Source.
In the United States, approximately 10% of the adult population has been diagnosed with MDD in the past 12 months. Now, this is a fairly recent publication as well, so this is obviously including all of the lockdown period.
Yeah, this is the lockdown period because this article is from 2020. I actually said in the beginning that I think there was done some research on the effects of psilocybin when it comes to cancer patients at Johns Hopkins University, and I think that was done in like 2014 or something, but maybe I'm wrong, but this is obviously a new article, and it then includes the lockdown time and just people, existing in a world that has some serious issues. That and also takes a toll on you.
Yes. And then the final part of this paragraph is that the yearly economic burden of major depressive disorder is estimated to be $210 billion. So there's a couple ways that this has been, generalized to a very wide audience. So we're talking about globally affected individuals. We're talking about how this has for a society and for an economy as a whole. People needing to take time off work, taking disability leave, of which I'm certainly aware of people who have needed to do this. They are looking obviously at just how many people in the past 12 months in the United States has been affected. But think about the economic burden of, the time off and, the potential treatment that people need. And so they're linking that as well, too. So you can see for something that's going to be where the research question is psilocybin-assisted therapy beneficial to patients with major depressive disorder, it has much broader implications and applications. And this is one thing I think a lot of students and even, PhDs coming in and beginning their research don't think about. It's very easy to narrow your research focus too much that writing a good introduction becomes difficult because you don't think about the applications of your research outside of what you're doing.
It gets so specialized and so narrow. But I mean, at least something like this, it might seem very unimportant because this is something that, for many people that are not familiar with something like psilocybin, and I'm not saying they never heard about it before, they don't care about it. This just seems like something very, on the fringes, something that is not very important. But put in the context of depression and how many people are suffering from it and the economical burden of people suffering from depression, doesn't matter why. It could be because they lost a family member due to COVID, maybe they lost their job, or maybe some other reason. Maybe they're just genetically inclined to suffer from depression. The point is that this is an enormous cost for society. So that is really what makes this project interesting, right?
Exactly.
It's not really the psilocybin on its own. It is the context. It is what it can be used to.
So from just that first paragraph, not only do we have a clear understanding of what the topic is, and that there's a problem to it, but we can actually focus in on other aspects of the same problem. The second paragraph comes down to talk about, and I quote, although effective apologies for this, although effective pharmacotherapies for depression are available, these drugs have limited efficacy, produce adverse effects, and are associated with patient adherence problems. Although many patients with depression showed reduced or remitted symptoms after treatment with existing pharmacotherapies, approximately 30 to 50% of participants did not respond fully, and as many as 10 to 30% of patients were considered treatment resistant, resulting in average effects that were only moderately larger than the effects of placebo.
So that is some real stuff right there. I mean, there's so many people that get prescribed antidepressants, so that's a multi-billion-dollar industry, probably. but it doesn't really work that well. And I mean, you have lots of different people in your life from different walks of life, and so have I. And I mean, I know people that has been taking antidepressants previously, and they don't really have that much good to say about them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just obviously a couple of people.
Yeah.
I'm not basing this on any kind of statistics, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
So let's think about the structure of this and not just necessarily the clear facts that demonstrate impact. So this is a really great use of evidence that provide examples of the problem, but also acts as a further explanation of the more specific issue with treating major depressive disorder. So we can start seeing how down into the second paragraph, we move from understanding the topic at kind of a global and then down to a national level, because this is obviously the journal of the American Medical Association. So this is research
of the United States.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they moved from a global context to the United States context, and now they're actually moving down to the individual patient context. And on top of that, not only have they narrowed their focus, but they are getting more specific in demonstrating current problems with treatment. So,
And also why psilocybin is something that could be used in therapy. Because
Exactly.
the conventional medicine doesn't really work. Or
Exactly.
it doesn't work that well. So they are, in
So
a way, discovering a gap or a problem.
Yeah, exactly. They're pointing out that there's definitely an area for more research. There's a problem with existing treatments that hasn't been solved yet. And now, as we move down into what would it be, there's 3 more paragraphs here. The third paragraph moves more specifically into the pharmacotherapies. So I'm not going to quote all of this because there is a lot of, for lack of a better term, medical mumbo jumbo, of which I'm probably going to mispronounce.
A lot of chemistry here.
Yes,
So,
they move into neurochemistry. And so they're basically now they're furthering their evidence by documenting and demonstrating several studies looking at a single type of treatment, ketamine infusion.
ketamine treatment, yes.
But they're presenting another problem that while there may be efficacy there, ketamine has high abuse liability, and it also involves moderate physiological risk that requires medical monitoring. So here we have kind of an even more specific problem linked to a specific form of pharmacotherapy.
The interesting thing here is that what they actually say at the end, or at least the way I think about it, is that ketamine is, as far as I know, a tranquilizer of some sort.
Yeah.
So this is obviously something that you could potentially kill yourself on if you take too much, as
Yes.
with any kind of tranquilizer or any kind of drug that will slow your heart rate and that kind of has that kind of effect.
Yes. So now they've done a very good job of establishing context and pointing out very specific problems with treating depression through a pharmacotherapy. So we have a good amount of evidence. We have lots of examples of the risk associated with this. All of that is well documented. They've used 12 citations at this point, of which, of course, you could go and see the actual effects and where this research is coming from if you went and looked at the literature cited, the bibliography or the reference list, whichever it is in this article. But now we actually move into what is this research specifically about. The combined serotonergic and glutamatergic. Again, apologies. I'm not a chemist or a doctor here.
I'm not going to try because
Yeah.
if you can't say it, then I can say it. Pretty sure about that.
Here's something that's very nice for a reader who isn't very legible in this sort of technical language. And so this isn't jargon. These are real chemical terms that
These are technical terms.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a good distinction to make, is that me trying to like fumble my way through pronouncing these neurochemicals, they give a what I think is the perfect thing to do. The combined serotonergic and glutamatergic action of psilocybin, then in parentheses, a classic hallucinogen. Okay, so now I have an understanding of what this is. It might not be a perfect understanding, but they give a much clearer, more easy to understand example of what it is they're trying to explain.
But it's still, I mean, there's still a lot of technical terms there that are not
Yes.
really explained. It's just taken for granted that people that read this article already know what it means. So they have, it's kind of clear that this is, they kind of know their audience.
Yes. We're at the point where you and I are far, surpassing what our knowledge is behind the meaning of some of these words. But
this article isn't intended for us.
no, of course not. Again, this is coming from the Journal of the American Medical Association's psychiatry section. But what they do is they come in, and now we're introduced to the word psilocybin. It took 4 paragraphs to get here. But they immediately move into expressing what psilocybin is and that there's preliminary evidence of the antidepressant effects when it's used with assisted therapy. They go in and talk about the potential of this assisted therapy as a novel antidepressant intervention. And for anyone who is trying to write and publish in a peer-reviewed journal, a word like novel is very important because you're demonstrating, you're presenting a new idea. That's what makes this research relevant, timely, new, basically.
What is also interesting is that they end this paragraph with relating it to ketamine once again, and that's basically saying that lower addiction liability and toxic effects of psilocybin compared to ketamine. So that's why they. So
Potential
that's
benefits.
kind of an elegant way to do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they're making a suggestion. There's reason to do this research because we know of the psychological and physiological detriments of current depression treatments using ketamine. And they strengthen that in the final paragraph. The substantial negative public health impact of major depressive disorder underscores the importance of conducting more research into drugs with rapid and sustained antidepressant effects. Current pharmacotherapies for depression have variable efficacy and unwanted adverse effects. Novel antidepressants with rapid and sustained effect on mood and cognition could represent a breakthrough in the treatment of depression and may potentially improve or save lives. Therefore, the primary objective of this randomized clinical trial was to investigate the effect of psilocybin therapy in patients with MDD, major depressive disorder.
What I just think is interesting here is that once in a while I have a conversation with a student, someone that books a consultation or sends me an email, or someone that wants to talk to me after a lecture, and let's say that I've been talking about clarity in academic writing. And they could ask about, could I write save lives, or is it too... or maybe it doesn't sound academic enough. And my response to that is, if it's going to save lives, then you just write save lives. Just be as concrete as possible. Because then it doesn't really matter if it sounds academic or not. If it's, or at least in this context, if it is on point and if that is exactly what you think it's going to do, then you can write that.
Yes.
It's not an exaggeration at all.
And this final paragraph really does a good job of both being concise, that it's rather short, 1, 2, 3, 4 sentences. It is incredibly clear. The clarity that is there. I mean, of course, you could make it more concise by working out some of the nominalization and the passive voice that's in there and turn this over to active voice. However, keeping in mind that some disciplines still prefer passive voice as a style, I think that this is almost as clear as you could make this. For someone who is not a neuroscientist, not a neurochemist, not a psychiatrist, not within the field of medicine at all, this last paragraph is easy to understand for someone like me.
It would be interesting to run it through is it the Gunning Fog Index? No.
Yeah. Why
where you could get
that?
how many years in school you have to have in order to understand what's in it. I mean, that could just be interesting.
Let's pull up this gunning fog index, which for those of you who are listening, gunning-fog-index.com, it allows you to paste in completed sentences, calculate
Your own or
them,
others?
and then what it will do is it more or less calculates the number of major punctuation marks, the total number of words, and your multi-syllable words. And it uses that to calculate the gunning fog index, which, as you said, is sort of a representation of how many formal years of education would somebody need to understand this. Now, it's a good tool to use, but I also caution people to say that just because something is a multi-syllable word doesn't mean that it is difficult to understand.
No. And it might be, let's say that there's a word that is a central part of the popular culture, for example. Then you obviously don't need 10 years of education in order to understand it.
Yeah.
So you have to take this with a grain of salt, but it's still a good tool, especially if there's stuff that is very difficult. And this could be a way to, let's say that you're kind of blind on your own writing, then this could be a good tool.
Exactly. So the gunning fog index score here is 22.15 for this last paragraph of the article. But when we actually look at it, is a word like underscore or importance or depression or potentially or investigate or therapy or patience. Those are all multi-syllable words, but it doesn't mean that they're difficult to understand.
I mean, kids learn the word investigate in kindergarten sometimes,
Yes.
right? Playing detective or something.
Yeah.
So a lot of these words are very, very standard, but some of them are more complex, like the one Padma something.
Yes. We could also go and run this through the writer's diet test as well and just have a look at... Oh, for some reason, it doesn't... It's loading right now. There we go.
It's loading. Okay, the writer's diet test is something that we've been using a couple of times on this podcast, and I also think that you have created a small video on it that you could watch on our YouTube channel. But this is basically... it's not similar to the gunning fog index. This one is looking at how many prepositions and stuff like that. Let's just see the results and see what happens.
writersdiet.com/test will get you here. And what it's going to do is you put in a sample of words. In this case, we're using, the last paragraph again. They've changed the format since the last time I was here. So
it just looks different.
Yeah, but we'll explain all of these. You see that it's going to calculate for be verbs, zombie nouns, which are nominalizations. Be verbs are basically the various forms of the verb to be, which are represented if you use active voice as weak verbs, essentially.
Being, for example.
Yeah. We have prepositions. I believe this adwords are probably adjectives, adverbs. It, this, that,
Possibly.
there. Vague pronouns. Okay, so let's run the test and let's see how this is going to work out for us. And this is going to be very silly if it tells me that I need to add this as an app. I just want to run the test.
Fingers crossed.
It's ineligible. I see why. It's not calibrated for writing samples under 100 words. So I'm going
so you just need to
I'm going to jump
stuff.
back and I'm going to take the previous paragraph as well. Geez, you'd think we're professionals and we would have this all figured out in advance.
But this was just something that we came up with. I mean, we didn't plan to run this through Gunning Fog Index or the Writer's Diet for that sake. So I'm sorry, listeners, if this takes time and if it's boring, but this is just something that we came up with on the fly. Probably because I just mentioned the Gunning Fog Index. But let's see what happens, because this is an interesting tool to use.
I still cannot get it to run. And I'm sure that we are over 100 words at this point. So perhaps there is currently an issue with this, because before I even put anything in, it said the sample has 0 eligible words. Okay, apologies for listeners and viewers, but you can actually, as Nicholas had said, you can go and see this on our YouTube channel, how it works. The design might have changed a little bit, but it works the same way. It would break down ways that we could further improve what we think is more or less already quite good writing. But as I've mentioned, the example is predominantly full of a lot of nominalization, the preposition of, which I also have an article on, or sorry, a video on. I think it's called Use This One Quick Tip to Drastically Reduce Your Word Count, or some clickbaity title like that, which basically we could make this more concise, which would also help with clarity. But it's not to say that the passive voice isn't following other principles of clarity. Short, clear sentences, very well constructed, general information towards more specific information. And I would just say that returning to that last paragraph, not only does it do a good job of pointing out exactly what the rest of this article is going to do, but it very clearly links what this research is doing in relation to everything else that they had presented. So they do a great job of summarizing the introduction to further solidify the importance of their research.
And it is very, very clear, and it's nicely written. So that was kind of the point, right? With hooking up the Gunning Fog Index and the Writer's Guide to kind of prove that this is pretty good writing, but it doesn't mean that it can probably be improved, but in general, this is very clear and easy to understand for a person like me, or like you, or some kind of journalist that is going to write something about this particular research. So with that as a segue, maybe we should jump over to the news article.
So here's where
this one is quite different. It's an interesting thing to compare.
This is an article by... Yeah, this is by Laura Sanders, and I found it just a couple of days ago, November 17th. As I said, this came to me when I went to sciencenews.org, and this was the news headline right there, smack dab on first thing on the page, which led us to the actual article. Now, let's have a look, and first of all, let's compare titles. Psilocybin may help treat depression, a small study finds. Yeah. Benefits of the compound found in psychedelic mushrooms lasted a month. Okay, let's compare that. How much does this title actually tell you, Nicholas?
Compared to the other title, the other title doesn't really hint at anything in particular. It just says something about that they have done a study. They have done an experiment. But this one is very much focused on the fact that it can help treat depression. So it does say that it's a small study, not a big study. So it's precise there. But then the second title, Benefits of the Compound Found in Psychedelic Mushrooms, lasted a month. So this is also something that is...
Is that people took mushrooms and were having a crazy hallucinogenic trip for a month?
For a month? Hopefully not. That would be inconvenient. That's an interesting thing, but it's also that I think some of the participants had that kind of effect, but not everybody. So this is also something that you usually see in journalism, that they have a tendency to exaggerate, or at least to generalize based on positive or negative results, depending on what they want to tell the audience.
Yes. And scientific journalism, like other forms of journalism, are looking to hook you on a short and catchy title. So when we compare the titles of Psilocybin may help treat depression, a small study finds, that doesn't give us a ton of information. It's almost like clickbait in a way. And I'm not saying that Science News is clickbait. Sciencenews.org is actually a really great place to go, because I was looking into the author as well, and I believe she has a PhD in neurosciences. So it's hard to get someone who's more qualified to report on a study of psilocybin-assisted therapy than someone who's actually a neuroscientist. But when we compare it to the JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, effects of psilocybin-assisted therapy on major depressive disorder, a randomized clinical trial, we get way more information as a reader about what this article is going to contain than what the science journalism provides us with. Remember, this is supposed to hook
because it doesn't
your
really say
attention
anything about the method or anything.
No. And what I also noticed as well, reading the title from the Science Journalism article, it may help treat depression, a small study finds. But then what happens when we immediately come down and read the first paragraph? Well, the first paragraph is actually just a sentence. Hallucinogenic mushrooms' key ingredient, psilocybin, can swiftly and dramatically ease depression in the right therapeutic setting, a small study suggests. So we went from something where there was an uncertainty claim. Psilocybin may reduce depression, and now we're saying that it swiftly and dramatically eases depression in the right therapeutic setting. A small study suggests.
Yeah, so the interesting thing here is that it doesn't really say anything about the effects of psilocybin. It's more that the setting is what actually, if you're in a horrible situation, then it's going to be then it's probably not going to have that effect. But in the right setting, it will.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously not correct.
Yeah. So there's something about certainty claims that end up getting made, which I want to return to because I think maybe we could just quickly link to, like, what's the overall audience for science journalism? Well, it's people who are not doctors, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, chemists, researchers. It is more for people like you and I. So there's definitely good information in here, but you can see the structure is, the paragraphs are typically not even paragraphs. They're actually individual sentences separated. So you're getting small tidbits of information. They don't really go in and provide you with an overview of how the study was conducted. They don't go in and give you a specific detail on which existing antidepressant drugs don't work so well.
They don't say much about that.
Yeah, they do give you some of the same numbers. Existing antidepressant drugs don't work well for an estimated 30 to 50% of people who try them. And when they do work, the effects can take weeks to kick in. There was much, much more detail in the actual medical journal
They just take
article.
what seems the most important. Another thing which I also noticed here is that they, in the actual experiment, they use this scale to determine how depressed the person is. You can find it in the other article. I'm not sure what the name was, but it was some kind of scale that they used. But
Yes.
here, that scale is not mentioned. You can find it here a little bit longer down, I think.
It's the Grid Hamilton Depression
Grid
Rating Scale.
Exactly.
That's provided in the actual medical science article.
But this one it's not mentioned here.
No.
Here they have translated. The thing is that according to, or at least in the original article, all the participants had I think a score that was around 23.5 or something on that scale. That was like the what do you call it, the genomsnitt, what's the name in English? What's the word in English?
That's a good one. I'm not sure. Genomsnitt.
Let's say that
through something.
No. It's the standard height of a Norwegian. Let's say it's 180 centimeters.
Oh,
but
so you're
obviously not everybody is that. They calculate it the way that they.
Yeah, the mean, because you have a mean, median, and mode, and so you're talking about when you talk about an average, which of those averages are you using? Because they'll skew the statistics in different ways.
On average. So these people obviously scored different on the test, but on average they scored 23.5 or something, and that is translated in the news article to, I think it was. It was in the moderate depression, but like high-end moderate depression.
Yeah.
That's the way they decided to translate the score of 23.5 on that scale. So I don't know if that is accurate, but it's something interesting that you should pay attention to, because these kind of things can be crucial. And if they're changed, I mean, the results might be completely different.
Exactly. It goes in and talks, it does give details about the methods, but we're not necessarily told that it was a randomized clinical trial. We get information about a comparison group, needing to wait 8 weeks, how many people were in that group. As you were talking, that grid scale, clinicians used it. It consists of 17 items to measure participants' symptoms. And that's probably because for us as readers, we don't need to know those fine details because it's not a tool that we're going to use. But recognizing how science is interpreted to popular science and how much information sort of gets lost along the way. And so, I mean, for those of you who are looking at, who are watching this on YouTube right now, you can kind of see, the structure is really simple. The clarity, the wording, the language, really easy to understand. Short, concise sentences. We got to give it good points for all of those things.
And it's very typical for a journalistic article. Start out with the most important stuff, have a punchline, and then all the necessary information should be in the beginning and the position of the writer. That means that if they think this is a good idea or a bad idea, that should be present fairly early in the article, usually straight in the beginning, and then it gets, less important information has a tendency to come at the end.
It kind of, it starts very specific and then it broadens out. We come now to the end and it moves into something that I hadn't even really paid that much attention to when I first looked this over. But how it actually then ends up dedicating quite a lot of time to how do we take these sorts of results from a very small study of only 24 people with, quite a few of them actually being people with cancer as well. And I believe from the official science article in the medical journal, it was like 67% of those participants were women as well, which I don't believe is mentioned in this article. But the science journalism article actually kind of goes and brings up the point that the majority of participants of those 24 people were white and is not representative of other ethnicities. And they end up dedicating quite a bit of space near the end as they kind of
40%. Yeah. 40% of the article is about the skin color of the participants. And this is something that is not really included in the original article, from the science article. This is something that you can basically see that, I don't know if this is a way to kind of critique the experiment, but it's definitely a way to, it's clearly influenced by current politics. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's fairly obvious.
Yeah.
And this is not really something that is discussed in the original paper. And at the end, it seems like they've been in contact with some of the, it says, of 282 people who participated in psychedelic studies from 1993 to 2017, the vast majority, 82%, were white. Williams and colleagues reported in a review article published in 2018 in BMC Psychiatry, "We're in the 21st century now," she says. "There's just no reason for this anymore."
So this Williams and colleagues you see actually appears a few paragraphs above where Monica Williams of the University of Ottawa, that's in Canada, who wasn't involved in this research, she is making these claims. So these are obviously, what's kind of interesting about this science journalism is that it brings in a lot of other social and cultural and political dynamics and ties together other people's research and kind of ongoing debates around the field that are not going to be included. I wouldn't have necessarily read through the effects of psilocybin-assisted treatment on major depressive disorder and really thought, oh, the majority of the people in here are white and 67% of them are women, and that's something to think about because those 24 participants will not be representative of the larger population of the world. I didn't really stop and think about that.
Brain chemistry are the same, I guess, but how you experience life is different.
Yeah.
So maybe that can affect the experience.
Yeah. So I think that you kind of get into, you have to realize too that science journalism obviously is able, in a way, I think, to kind of confront many more of these other biases. Whereas the way that science writing for peer review is it's very focused. So it doesn't leave a lot of room for debate in a peer-reviewed journal, unless if you're an expert on it and you can go in and debate the methods and debate the results. But the interpretation of that as to how these results can impact on a broader spectrum of society, that's like one of the really great benefits of science journalism is it can pull in outside perspectives and it kind of looks at other discussions and debates that might be happening in the field. Now, again, the author of this, Laura Sanders, is a neuroscience writer. Okay, she actually holds a PhD in molecular biology. So it's someone who, is within the natural sciences enough. She's obviously not a psychiatrist.
No.
And she's obviously not a neuroscientist either. But maybe there's enough translation that happens that there's also some trustworthiness here.
And at least she's probably familiar with the scientific method, and she's just not like any journalist. So that probably makes a big difference. What I also think is important here is that, as we talked about earlier, most people get into science through articles like this, not the original article from a peer-reviewed journal. So I think these articles are extremely important because that's what gives a lot of these results or studies any kind of social momentum and political momentum. But when reading articles like this, you can't always, you have to take them with a grain of salt because you don't really know the position of the writer. There might be politics that influence how they view something in that article. There's a lot of different factors that you need to take into consideration that you should obviously take them into consideration when reading the original article as well, but they are usually so static in a way. They have to follow this specific formula, and a news article like that doesn't really have the same restrictions. So the format is so different that if you really want to get into it, read the original article or articles. But you should at least check the sources and see who the writer is, and I think that's some good advice.
There's a gauge of trustworthiness as well, especially when it's very easy for people to just sort of accept what they read on the internet as a fact, which returns me to the certainty claim. So first of all, what I think is that science news seems trustworthy because they linked to the actual article. I could go and find and gain access to the article from the Journal of the American Medical Association. If a science article doesn't provide access or a link or directly cite the article that they're mentioning, you should maybe question it a little bit because you have no opportunity to do, as a good researcher does, go in and kind of fact check. So there's that sign of trustworthiness, but then there's also what happens with these, what you could call certainty claims. No medical journal that I've ever looked at in all of the years of working, at the university and having a mother who's a nurse and looking into some of this stuff out of my own curiosity, I have never really seen a medical professional make a certainty claim to say, oh yes, in this case, psilocybin mushrooms works. No, they say it may work. It has the possibility to, and they
have to be very careful. They have to be very careful. I mean, this is something that I've also encountered when I've been speaking to doctors, and they usually say that it can work like this. It usually works like this, but I cannot guarantee you anything because sometimes they talk to people where their life is on the line, or at least their life quality. So promising them any type of result is very unprofessional, to be completely honest.
Yes, so much so that in the actual Journal of the American Medical Association article we were looking at, in the discussion before the conclusion, they have a section talking about the limitations of their research. So you could go in and see that they are even acknowledging potential problems in their research design, in the experiment, with the methods they used, with the way that they analyzed the results, how they interpreted the results. You don't get that to the same degree in science journalism, because science journalism, no matter how trustworthy it is, it's still trying to sell you a story. It's going to... So you saw that certainty claim emerge. In the first paragraph of the article, you get this title that's like, oh, something, something, that grabs your attention, but doesn't provide you any real detail. It just
illegal.
It piques your curiosity, and then you read something, and it makes it seem like, hey, if you are depressed and you do psilocybin mushrooms, your depression will be cured or drastically reduced. And then they kind of tag on, a small study suggests. So
and this is something to be careful with.
Because you kind of get two competing claims where it's like, hey, there's this drastic and incredibly easy reduction of depression, something suggests. You can read it and think, oh, hey, scientists and doctors have figured something out. Like, perfect. And then, well, why isn't this working for me? Well,
there's two different things here. One is, as you said earlier, with the clickbait. I mean, you have to be honest, it's based on the same kind of theoretical principle that if something grabs your attention, then, that title wins. That article, it's more popular. So everything is kind of working within that realm when it comes to journalism. But then on the other side, we have the complexity of a study like this. That there's so much complexity going on and so much uncertainty that you can't really condense that down to anything that makes any sense. You can, but once again, this person wants people to read the article. They don't want to be misleading, but they don't want it to be uninteresting. So
there's a balance.
This is something. There's a balance there that you need to be aware of when you read articles like this, and especially about the controversial topic. I think then it's even more important because it's kind of taboo. I mean, we're talking about illegal drugs, so there's a lot of different emotions when it comes to a debate like this.
Exactly.
That kind of treatment.
And I think that there's also something else that, as a reader of science journalism, we need to be aware of, and that is to watch out for these certainty claims when preliminary results are being reported. So there was something, while we were getting this all set up and I was waiting for you to come online, on my Facebook feed, a friend of mine had posted up a New York Times article on, the efficacy of some of these new COVID vaccines. And when I was reading through it, it's like there's no link to the research. And then it's sort of like way down at the bottom, it's like, oh, preliminary reports coming out from a currently unpublished study. Well, okay, we're starting to develop these certainty claims, 95% effectiveness, lifetime or long-term immunity are terms that are getting thrown around by the journalist.
And people are so desperate for good news at the same time. Yeah.
And this is based off of results that haven't been published, have not been peer-reviewed. We don't have a way of understanding, okay, so how many people were involved in this? What was the method that was used? What was the demographic that was being tested? Through the peer review process, a lot of these things should hopefully end up getting evaluated. Now, at the same time, I understand that if you're conducting research on humans, many countries have an ethics standard, so we can assume that ethics were followed and that the methods were sound. But the problem with also using preliminary results is you don't know if those are outliers. You don't know if those fall, right in the mean of things, in that central node of the statistics. We're not even necessarily getting enough information to make a very informed opinion about those facts because we don't have all of the facts and we don't have enough facts about the facts. Yet these certainty claims are still being made.
And this is something that also happens all the time, that you read some kind of, scientific news article and, very promising results, 95% or something like that. But as you said, it's not really been done that much research. So a lot of the times, as years go by and more research are conducted, it's usually not that impressive. It goes a little bit back and forth. Different projects show different results, sometimes dramatically different results, because they use completely different set of methods. And so as time goes by, good news has a tendency to become moderately good news, or maybe even bad news.
Yeah. I think this also leads to where some of the public distrust comes from of scientists and medical professions is partly because of how science journalism reports these as if they are factually true. And sort of it also comes with the general public's sort of scientific illiteracy, that we're looking for concrete facts or truths, and we're getting these sort of certainty claims. But that's not how science really works. So
When you look under the hood, it's so much more complex.
Yeah,
And I think it's
exactly.
the scientific that people don't really know what a lot of these different words mean, can't understand the content, and also that, as you said, the media makes some promises that are not fulfilled, and then people blame the scientists. Darn scientists!
Exactly.
They
You start losing faith because the world doesn't end up working out the way that the science journalists reported it. So I ended up reading this really interesting blog posting from Scientific American by an author called Bora Zivkovic from 2010. So this is a decade old at this point, but I'm going to link it. I'm not going to go into great detail, but it'll be linked in the show notes that you can access it and read it. And they did a very good job of sort of walking through how science communication has developed through the centuries and kind of where we were in 2010 with social media and the internet. And I'm sure that, there's maybe some other really great research on these sorts of things. But what I kind of took away from it is that you should think about scientific journalism is designed to communicate what is current. And science articles are designed to communicate how the world works. And those can be two very different things.
what is current is basically what is contemporary, what is interesting right now. And now
And
it's
science-
obviously COVID.
And science changes. Preliminary results do not necessarily dictate trends of end results. Additional future studies may kind of overturn data that we had in the past. And so science is always evolving and looking for better and better and better answers to things, which is why we're so rarely going to use a certainty claim as a scientist or as a researcher, because there's this
There's so
understanding.
many factors to
Yeah.
take into consideration. It's so complex, and that goes for any scientific discipline. I mean, there's unlimited complexity in anything if you look deep enough. So the effects of it doesn't matter if it's medicine against COVID-19, if it's psilocybin. I mean, it's pretty obvious that there are certain things that can happen. But at the same time, it's so complex that you don't really know how this will affect the real world in a real what is the name? Therapeutical setting.
Yeah.
If you're in, yeah. So I think it's important to take a lot of these articles with a grain of salt, because it is what is interesting right now. What is contemporary, what is in the pop culture. And right now, there's a reason that this article was trending. A lot of people are experiencing depression to a certain extent because of social isolation, because they lost their job, because lots of different things. Maybe a relative died or is in the hospital.
Exactly. There's, if I could sum all of it up, at least this latter half on science journalism. Science journalism gives us a lot of pros because it kind of condenses a lot of heavy technical research into something that's very easy to access and easy to read.
Digestible for most people.
Yeah, and it does focus on a lot of things that are going to be much more relevant to us in our everyday life. But in doing that, we also always need to remember that, there's not that same rigorous peer review process. There's competition for publishing space. There might be bias within the business model of whoever is reporting it. There's definitely even though scientific articles face word count limitations, those word count limitations are so much stronger in journalism. You know, you
Oh
need
yeah. It
you
needs
need
to be super
1,000
short.
words or less, whereas
Yeah.
we're able in many journals we're able to write 5 to 8,000 words. So there's a
So
lot more
they
detail.
basically need to condense any kind of topic.
Yeah.
And then they need to, as we talked about, have a catchy title. You, they need a position, like, and a lot of these articles are also a lot easier influenced by politics, because they're, I mean, in within the scientific community, it's obviously also affected by politics, but it's a much slower process. When it comes to journalism, it's usually just one people writing an article. They obviously have, it needs to go through the editor, but it's, the scientific process is much more complex.
Yeah. And some other things that we should just be careful about, especially with the way that information is fed to us on the internet, is watch out that you're not creating an echo chamber for yourself. That this is also one of the main differences, I think, between scientific writing and scientific journalism. People will tend to go and find scientific journalism that suits their worldview and sort of confirms their bias. And if you're not a critical reader and if you're not critically assessing those journal articles, the science journalism articles, looking for those certainty claims, looking to see if they link to the actual report, kind of assessing the validity or the credibility of the author and the trustworthiness of the site, but also realizing that just generally the cookies that track what you look for kind of want to feed you more of the same thing, whereas science articles encourage debate. They encourage the understanding that we're not going to make certainty claims. We're not going to make strong certainty claims, at least, because we may always be wrong. And I think that that's a better approach to take because it opens you up to more possibilities. So I think be critical.
Things aren't that black and white.
No. I think
right? It's everything in between. So
as a reader of either science articles or science journalism, it's important to be critical and try to look for some of these biases, look for some of the limitations or weaknesses within, but also do what we did earlier. Check over the structure. How are these things established? Not just to get a sense of how are they trying to get you to read this and see the importance and application of it, but especially for people who are writers themselves, how can you emulate that? And doing so,
it's going to be all right.
I would say so, yeah.
I would say so. So this is probably one of the longest podcasts that we've done.
It's gone on for a while. So if you've made it this far, again, thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out and contact us, Writing Center at nmbu.no. For more of the technical side of things, go and check out NMBU Writing Center on YouTube, where we document and show a lot more of this stuff, especially if you were listening and you want to see these articles. I will link everything that we have looked at and talked about today in the show description as well, with a couple of extra goodies. And of course, if you're needing any kind of mental support as a student or employee at NMBU, SIT and the university's association with the health station in Oss are there and willing to help you.
All right. I think that was a perfect ending.
The perfect conclusion. Great. Well, again, Nicholas, as always, thanks for a delightful chat, and I'm glad we got to cover such a broad spectrum of topics today. This was a lot of fun.
Broad spectrum of controversial topic, but doesn't matter. You could still pick it apart using the writing principles.
All right. Until next time.
Until next time.
Take care and be safe, everybody.